A survivor recounts the story of a prisoner who worked in the ovens at Auschwitz. At a certain moment, this prisoner stopped carrying bodies on the stretcher and stood still, motionless, staring fixedly at the corpses. After a long pause, he resumed his work. An SS officer who was nearby asked why the man had stopped. Another prisoner replied, he just recognized his wife. And this type of incident, in which members of the Sonderkommando recognized their murdered relatives, was not rare. The cremation ovens burned day and night, with thousands of people passing through them every day. The trauma was so overwhelming that it shattered even the most resilient spirits. If you're wondering, yes, that's right. It wasn't the SS who worked inside the gas chambers. It was the prisoners, often ordered to massacre their own loved ones. The Sonderkommando operated in the vicinity of the crematoria, responsible for both the before and the after of the process. They were present in the undressing room, in the final moments of the Jews who arrived from all regions of Europe. They spoke with these people moments before they were taken to the gas chambers. Some recognized familiar faces from before the war, but the vast majority were strangers. Still, all were brothers in suffering. They removed the bodies from the gas chambers. The bodies piled one atop another was the universal memory. Like statues, was the description used by one witness. The color of the bodies was normal. This was repeated several times. The Sonderkommando carried the bodies to the elevator. They inspected them for gold teeth and removed them. They placed the bodies into the ovens, 3 to 5 at a time, for cremation. Before the ovens were operational, or when they couldn't handle the number of corpses, they were burned in pits layered with wood. Bones that did not disintegrate during burning were crushed, and the ashes taken to the river to be scattered. The work shifts were long. 12-hour shifts were the standard, as described by Sonderkommando survivors. They had no illusions. They were as certain as anyone could be that the Germans were murderers involved in mass extermination operations on a scale that defied all description. Their personal situation was paradoxical. As long as the transports kept arriving, the Sonderkommando were necessary. As long as they were necessary, they would remain alive. But when they were no longer needed, they would be among the first to die, for they were the most dangerous witnesses of the entire extermination process. Today, we will delve deeper into who the Sonderkommando were, how they lived, what they saw, and the unimaginable burden they carried every single day. We will explore survivor testimonies to shed light on one of the most disturbing and least known realities of the Nazi extermination camps. Get ready! When a new transport full of people arrived at Auschwitz, they were unloaded, and then a selection process began. SS officers divided the newly arrived prisoners into 2 groups. The majority were placed to one side, composed of women, children, the elderly, and the sick, and were predominantly sent to the gas chambers. Men who appeared strong and healthy were directed to the other side. Many of these men were chosen to become part of the Sonderkommando, a special force tasked with operating the very machinery of death. A survivor of Auschwitz would later comment that these men were torn from their everyday lives and, without warning, thrown into the deepest pits of hell. The gas chambers at Auschwitz had a single function: to turn innocent, living people into corpses. Hundreds of thousands of corpses. The main job of the Sonderkommando was to empty the gas chambers after the executions, then search the bodies and burn them. Obviously, the members of the Sonderkommando found the work extremely disturbing, but they had 2 choices: either do the work or face immediate execution. Today, we will also go in-depth into the account of Eliezer Eisenschmidt, a survivor of the Sonderkommando, who took part in an interview after the liberation of the camp. Do you remember your first day of work in the Sonderkommando? Do you still remember the exact date? Yes, I remember the exact date. It was December 9th, late at night. During dinner, we suddenly heard someone shouting in German, "Everyone in formation." We ran outside while the guards shouted, "Raus! Raus! Out! Out!" We had to line up quickly in rows of 5. 80 or 100 people were selected for the Sonderkommando from Block 2. It all happened very fast. We were taken to the barracks, and there the gates were closed. That was it. I left a piece of bread in Block 9 and never saw it again. The prisoners of the Sonderkommando were divided into 5 groups, each consisting of about 200 men. Each group was assigned to one of the 5 crematoria. Inside these crematoria, they were further divided into smaller work groups, with each having a distinct task. The first group was assigned to work on the unloading ramps when new transports arrived. Their job was to ensure that panic did not spread, so they were forced to deceive the newcomers by saying they were going for a bath and disinfection. To maintain calm among the new prisoners, the members of the Sonderkommando would offer seemingly helpful advice. For example, they advised the newcomers to tie their shoes together after undressing and to remember to place their clothes in the changing room. Many of the Sonderkommando members avoided looking the newcomers in the eye. They knew these people were destined for the gas chambers and that there was no return. A survivor's account describes how one man was tasked with leading the newcomers from the train to the gas chamber. This man suddenly recognized his cousin in the crowd and found himself facing an impossible dilemma. Should he reveal the horrifying truth to his cousin or maintain the lie? He knew that, whatever his choice, the result would be the same. So he chose to lie. He told his cousin the same thing he told every new prisoner, that they were simply going to take a shower. He then made sure that his cousin stood directly beneath the hole through which the Zyklon B pellets were dropped, hoping that this would mean a quick death for him. And of course, the members of the Sonderkommando knew that it was not a quick death. They heard the screams of the people inside the gas chamber for 15 to 20 minutes before silence finally fell. After that, the gas chamber was ventilated, and another group of the Sonderkommando began their work. Please explain exactly how the prisoners were chosen for the Sonderkommando. Did the Germans select them based on any specific criteria? Number. All that mattered in the selection was that they were young and strong men. I was there with my brother. They chose me for the Sonderkommando but didn't choose him. They must not have liked him. Maybe he wasn't strong enough for them. Did they examine the men thoroughly to determine their physical condition? No. The examination was superficial, quick and brief, just like the selection on the platform. In total, 450 men were chosen. Then we marched in rows of 5 to the barracks, and they closed the gates behind us. That was it. Did you have to undress for this selection? No, we didn't have to undress this time. Where in Birkenau was the selection for the Sonderkommando carried out? On the left side of the camp from the entrance, in the area where the gravel stands were located. Later, this complex served as the women's camp, the FKL, Frauenkonzentrationslager. At that time, there were only 2 camps in Birkenau. A and BA was for male prisoners, and B for women. Who carried out the selection for the Sonderkommando? The SS men. They called us out for a head count, took us out of the barracks, and didn't let us return. They surrounded us with especially large dogs and began selecting the number of workers they wanted from the entire barrack. As I said, they didn't take my brother. When the door was opened, the members of the Sonderkommando were confronted with row upon row of dead people. Often the people were so tightly packed inside the chambers that the bodies remained standing even after death. Sometimes, the corpses were horribly intertwined. This was due to death convulsions, or because someone in panic had tried to climb over another in a desperate attempt to escape the gas. According to survivor reports, there were about 800 corpses in the gas chamber at a time. The Sonderkommando had to use rods with hooks to pull the bodies by the chin and drag them out. At first, they approached this task carefully, trying to show respect for the dead. But with time and repeated exposure, their sensitivity faded away, and they became increasingly indifferent to the task. The bodies were taken out of the chamber, placed on an elevator, and brought to the upper level. Upstairs, another group of the Sonderkommando had to cut the hair from each body. The hair had to be removed before the corpses were placed in the ovens. This group was also responsible for searching the bodies for jewelry and gold. A former member of the Sonderkommando would later confess that everyone knew exactly where to look for valuables. There are only a few places where a naked person could hide a gold ring or a diamond. After being shaved and searched, the bodies were sent to the next Sonderkommando group. This group was known as the dentists. Each of them was equipped with dental pliers. They examined each corpse's mouth for gold teeth. These teeth were extracted, and the gold was later melted down and turned into bars collected by the SS. After the dental inspection, the members of the Sonderkommando divided the bodies into two piles, one for adults and another for children. The final Sonderkommando group operated the ovens. They lined up the corpses in front of each of the 5 furnaces, then stacked them onto a metal stretcher. Next, they placed a child's body on top and pushed the bodies into the oven. After the corpses were cremated, the members of the Sonderkommando removed the ashes and dumped them into a nearby river. How long did the selection take? It didn't take more than 10 minutes. I barely understood what was happening, as I had arrived at the camp only a few days earlier. How could I have understood that this was the selection for the Sonderkommando? The SS surrounded us, and the dogs seemed even more dangerous than the guards themselves. Months later, I saw those dogs in action between the crematoria and the sector of the camp called Canada. When we arrived at Block 2, we were surprised. The barracks were empty, but there was plenty of food. Bread and potatoes left us astonished. I ate greedily until I remembered where we were. There, they divided us into 4 groups, and each one chose a mattress among the rows of bunks. It was a strange feeling, comfort and fear at the same time. Were the Sonderkommando barracks separated? Yes, Block 2 was reserved for the men of the Sonderkommando. Block 1 was for the Strafkommando, penal detail, and Block 3 for the common prisoners. What happened to your brother? They assigned him to Block 9. He lasted 3 weeks and then died. Please describe your first day in the Sonderkommando. There was another head count the following day. They removed the Jews whose serial numbers were higher than 38,000. Most of them had been deported from France to Birkenau in June and July 1942. Then the positions were distributed: capo, group leader, and so on. We were divided into 2 groups, Sonderkommando 1 and Sonderkommando 2. There were about 150 men in each group. As we left, we were again surrounded by SS men with dogs, and they led us into the forest. There we were divided again. One group was assigned to work in the room where valuables were kept, to separate belongings from the clothes of the murdered people. The second group was tasked with cremating the bodies. The Germans asked, "Are any of you barbers?" Several men stepped forward and were given scissors. Then they asked, "Are any of you dentists?" A few more stepped forward and were given pliers. The remaining men were then divided into groups of 6. For example, 6 men pushed the carts that carried the corpses. These were the Schleppern, those who dragged the bodies to the ovens. How the Germans divided us into groups even before opening the doors of the gas chamber meant that we didn't know exactly what they would do with us. Obviously, when I was placed in the group that would carry the bodies, I had no idea what that entailed. In the ghetto, when I worked at the sawmill, I had gained some experience with carts. But there, we carried planks on those carts. We were taken to a barge and then unloaded the carts. They led us to the courtyard and opened the door of the gas chamber, shocking us deeply. We were in utter mourning. We had never seen anything like it. I saw a dead, naked woman bent over, and we stood paralyzed, unable to comprehend. The bodies in the gas chamber formed a massive heap. Orders came. The Schleppern put on masks to remove the bodies, examined the mouths for gold, and pulled out teeth with pliers. Barbers cut the hair, and the Schleppern loaded the bodies onto carts to throw them into the pit. The Heiser group kept the fires burning in the cremation furnaces. When we heard these terrible orders, we began to move quickly. As I said, I was part of the group that carried the bodies on the carts. For a few minutes, I was so shocked that I couldn't touch a single body. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before. Obviously, I wasn't the only one in the group to feel repulsed. I couldn't work until someone struck me hard across the back with a stick. That's when I realized there was no escape, no turning back. I had to accept the idea and the situation. You must understand, We had absolutely no choice. That was my fate. Anyone in my situation would have reacted the same way. In my group were 4 brothers from Makov and another Jew. 6 men operated each cart. 4 would grab the bodies by the arms and legs and throw them onto the cart. 2 made sure they didn't fall off. We pushed the cart to the trench, where the fire brigade waited to throw the bodies into the flames. The trenches were deep and wide, with fires already burning before the bodies arrived. To prepare the site, they dismantled the wooden houses of the old village of Brzezinka, and the beams served as a base at the bottom of the pits. 6 carts transported the bodies in shifts, each carrying 10 to 15 corpses per trip. Most of the time, members of the Sonderkommando were isolated from the other prisoners in the camp. Their own quarters were located inside the crematoria. In some cases, they slept directly above the gas chambers. They were officially forbidden to communicate with any other prisoners. However, some contact did occur. Some prisoners had better conditions than others. The Sonderkommandos, the crematorium workers, were kept reasonably well fed, and the SS officers knew they needed to be strong to perform their duties. They were not subjected to starvation and torture at the same level as other prisoners. This slightly better treatment of the Sonderkommandos had another purpose. They had to receive the new arrivals at the camp. Being received by someone who appeared relatively well fed gave the new prisoners the illusion that things were not as bad as they seemed. Their quarters were also somewhat better than those of other prisoners, and because they worked indoors, they were sheltered from severe weather conditions. However, this treatment was an illusion. The work was so horrific that many of them went insane from the horrors they witnessed. To prevent the Sonderkommandos from telling anyone what was happening inside the crematoria, every 2 or 3 months they were gathered and executed. There was always a new trainload of young men ready to replace them. Tragically, one of the first tasks of the newly recruited Sonderkommandos was to burn the bodies of their predecessors. Another prisoner, a man from the main camp, recalled how one rainy night he found himself near the camp mortuary, located in the basement of one of the blocks. He noticed a line of men waiting at the entrance. When he asked what they were doing there, he received a chilling answer. One of the men pointed to the door at the end of the stairs and explained, "Down there, behind that door, is death. This is our end. Behind those doors, the SS is exterminating us." The other prisoners asked why they didn't flee, hide, or try to do something to save themselves. The man replied, "We are the Sonderkommandos. We are broken. We are wasting away. This is our way out of this hell." Only a few Sonderkommandos survived the war. Morris Venezia was one of those survivors. In his testimony, he recalled the day when the transports of Hungarian Jews arrived. About 30,000 people. The furnaces had already reached their maximum capacity and could not handle the number of bodies. The Sonderkommandos were forced to dig trenches behind the crematorium, and bonfires were lit in the pits to burn the excess bodies. Sometimes miracles also happened, though they were short-lived. One Sonderkommando reported how a baby survived the gas chamber because its head was shielded under its mother's arm. Later, the baby was shot by an SS officer, and its body was thrown onto the pile. In another case, a man regained consciousness just as he was about to be thrown into a burning pit. Confused, he asked what was happening. There was no time to send him back to the gas chamber, so by order of the SS officers, the Sonderkommandos were forced to throw him alive into the flaming pit. How many hours did you work per day? When I arrived at the camp, the work usually lasted the entire day. After the bodies were burned and the gas chambers were cleaned, they took us back to the camp. Once we worked for 36 hours, almost without stopping. Later, in the spring of 1943, when the new crematoria were built, the Sonderkommando began working in a completely different way. After the bodies were placed in the pits, the stokers used gasoline to ignite the wooden beams. When the fire grew, the stokers piled the bodies into a heap so they would burn faster. The Germans had designed this procedure so that the fat from the bodies would feed the fire. In other words, the bodies themselves served as fuel. When we arrived there, the pits were still empty, and the fire had not yet begun to burn the bodies. Thus, the intensity of the fire depended on the wooden beams that had been soaked with fuel. Later, the fire was fed by the fat from the bodies that remained in the pits. It took an entire day, and sometimes even a day and a half. When there were no more bodies to burn, we had to cut down trees and clean the gas chamber. Did you know those were the bodies of Jews? We didn't know at first, but other workers who had been there longer, such as the capo Daniel, quickly told us. He told us, and the rumor spread. Jews were being murdered in that building, and it was our job to throw them into the fire pyres. Obviously, as this continued, we realized it ourselves when we saw that the men were circumcised. Many also wore necklaces with stars of David. Do you remember how the victims were forced to undress? Of course. They were taken to wooden huts that served as undressing rooms. They had once been stables. People undressed there and then had to run naked to the house that was used as a gas chamber. They had to cross the yard running in all kinds of weather. Did the victims know what awaited them when they arrived at the camp? I didn't know. At that moment, I had no contact with the people. I think many wanted to believe that the worst did not await them, even when they felt that something was wrong. Can you describe the first gas chamber? The one that used to be a farmhouse? On the door, there was a sign that read, "Bath." There were two entrances, one for leading the victims inside and another for removing the bodies. The bath sign was fixed outside, right in front of the entrance door. In what language was the sign written? Only in German. All the windows and openings of the building were sealed with rubber joints to prevent the gas from escaping. After the room was filled with people, the doors were closed. Then an SS man came with the Zyklon gas in his hands. He put on a gas mask, opened the gas container, and threw the contents inside. Shortly after the gas was released, people began to smell it. And then we heard them shouting Shema Yisrael from inside the gas chamber. The German shouted to his fellow soldiers, "They're saying Schmeiß rein, throw it in, throw it in." Did they put men and women together in the gas chamber? Yes, men, women, and children all together. How long did the gassing last? About 20 minutes. Did everyone in the chamber die after 20 minutes? Yes, but to be sure, the Germans waited a bit longer before opening the doors. Only the Germans themselves opened the door of the gas chamber. They never assigned that task to anyone else. It was always like that. They never allowed the Jews, that is, us, to open the door. After the final extermination of the Hungarian transports and the cremation of the bodies, it became clear that there would be no more work for the Sonderkommandos, at least for a while. They knew that a mass execution was imminent, and so the prisoners who worked in Crematorium 4 decided to plan a revolt. The men began to make improvised knives and homemade grenades. These grenades were made with cans and black powder that had been smuggled in by women who worked in an aircraft repair workshop outside the camp. On October 7, 1944, one of the Sonderkommandos approached an SS officer and struck him on the head with a hammer. That began the revolt. Suddenly, the camp plunged into chaos, with prisoners surrounding the guards with knives, hammers, and powder bombs. Apparently, one of the SS officers, known for being particularly sadistic, was captured, thrown into one of the furnaces, and burned alive. Some prisoners managed to cut the fence and escape the camp. However, the victory was short-lived. The revolt was quickly contained, and all the fugitives were captured. The Sonderkommandos were executed, as were the women who had helped them make the bombs. How long did it take from the moment the door was opened until the bodies were removed? The bodies were taken out immediately after the doors were opened. The men assigned to this task wore gas masks. Once, they found a girl who apparently hadn't inhaled enough gas. She was still unconscious but alive, making guttural sounds. A German corporal shot her on Moll's orders. During your work in the crematoria, did you ever find the bodies of relatives or friends? Once, I recognized the body of a cousin. It was horrible. She had been taken on January 23, 1943, in a late transport. I saw her after she had been gassed. To conclude your account about working in the bunker, I have one more question. How long did you work there? I worked there for about 6 months, from the day I arrived until the new crematoria began operating in May and June 1943. What position were you assigned in the Sonderkommando after the construction of the new crematoria? When we began working in crematorium 4-5, I told the Germans that I was an electrician, so they assigned me to be the electrician of the crematorium. Until then, for 6 months, I had worked in the bunker with the bodies every day. In the crematorium building, they gave us a small workroom behind the crematorium facilities, next to the coal house. That was where the coal was kept. There was a laundry right next to it, and a door was opened to some latrines. The Germans tore down the inner walls and turned it all into a single room, the electrician's room. Why did you present yourself as an electrician? The Germans were looking for people with useful trades, such as carpenters and shoemakers. When they asked for an electrician, I volunteered. Were there other electricians in the Sonderkommando? Yes, there was a Jew from France who was also assigned to work as an electrician, but I don't remember his name. What were your duties as an electrician in the Sonderkommando? The electrician did several types of work. For example, from time to time you had to replace burned-out light bulbs in the corridors, things like that. Were you still part of the Sonderkommando during your time as an electrician? Yes, of course. I worked in the Sonderkommando. Even when I worked as an electrician, I saw the crematoria every day. In October 1944, after the Sonderkommando uprising broke out, only 30 men from my building survived. I survived too, but I had to return to cremation work, burning dead people or prisoners who had been executed. I did that about once a week or more, whenever the Germans executed a certain number of prisoners. We could tell by the smell that some of them were Russian prisoners of war. At that time, the surviving members of the Sonderkommando were assigned the following tasks. One of us tended the furnaces, another pushed the bodies into the furnaces. I would like to add that on days when there was no work, I was sent to weed the concentration camp grounds. They fed the horses with the weeds we pulled out. In January 1945, the Soviet army was advancing rapidly. Because of this, the Nazis began the plan to liquidate the Auschwitz concentration camp. As the front line approached, all the Auschwitz crematoria were destroyed with explosives in an attempt to erase the evidence of genocide. The Nazis also knew they needed to eliminate all witnesses. Shortly before the evacuation of the camp, there was a final selection. Those prisoners who still appeared healthy were separated and sent to another concentration camp in Germany, in an event that would later become known as the Auschwitz Death March. The sick and weak, along with the remaining members of the Sonderkommandos, were separated from the main group. They knew they were about to die. However, due to the general chaos and the apparent disorganization of the SS, some of the Sonderkommandos managed to quietly blend in with the other prisoners destined for the other camp. Those who escaped that final selection were still in great danger. An SS officer could recognize them at any moment. The forced march, covering hundreds of kilometers through the harsh Polish winter, was grueling, and each day the group left behind dozens of frozen corpses. Some prisoners managed to escape during the death march, while others reached the concentration camps in the interior of Germany, where they endured several more months of torment. Several thousand prisoners had been forced to work as Sonderkommandos. However, by the end of the war, fewer than 20 had survived. Of those survivors, only a handful decided to testify, and understandably so. Initially, these men were seen as collaborators with the Nazis. Did you ever come into contact with people waiting for death inside the crematorium building? Yes. The men of the Sonderkommando were allowed to move freely in the undressing room. The only restriction was that we were not allowed to speak to them, so there would be no chance of warning them and causing a riot. I could move freely around there, but I could not talk to the people. Did men and women undress together? Yes. Entire families would come into the inner courtyard of the crematorium, and then enter together into the room where they would undress. They were not separated in any way. They were all together in the gas chamber. Men and women were not separated. In some cases, the Germans tried to do it differently and bring the men first. But those cases didn't work out. The men tried to resist, and there were beatings. I think knives were drawn too. The Germans concluded that the only way to do it calmly was to keep the victims together. In most cases, when a man tried to defend himself, his wife would say, "Stay calm, maybe it's not as terrible as you think." Were there people who refused to undress? There were religious Jews who refused to get naked. Once, there was a young girl from a very religious family who didn't want to undress. Her mother asked one of the Sonderkommando prisoners in the room not to force her daughter to remove all her clothes. "Let her go to the bath in her underwear," she said. "A naked man is absolutely defenseless. He loses his stability, his confidence, and his strength." To whom did the mother make this request? To our foreman, who was near us. He said, "Very well, let her keep her underwear on. Go with her to the bath, but make sure none of the SS notice it." Was that possible? In certain cases, it was possible to deceive the SS, since the room was crowded, and it wasn't possible to distinguish each person individually. Do you remember other cases in which people wished to remain in their underwear? I saw Jews who kept part of their underwear on. How did the Germans react to that? Sometimes, when they noticed, they would have an outburst of rage. Other times, they simply ignored it. When Maul saw someone in underwear, he used his baton to strip the person by force. But other Germans weren't as strict and didn't do anything about it. How long did it usually take for people to undress? It usually took from half an hour to 45 minutes. It depended on how many people were in the room. The SS stood there, prodding people and shouting, "Faster! Faster!" They reminded people to tie their shoes together in pairs so they wouldn't get lost. Or they said, "That way you won't waste time later looking for the other shoe." Have you ever encountered acquaintances in the undressing room? Once, a friend told me that a cousin of mine had been brought from the Buna camp. I didn't work in that particular sector. In Buna, he had worked in the coal mines. There, he became ill and turned into a Mussulman. My cousin asked about me, and my friend told him that maybe I could save him, but he didn't ask me to do that. Before dying, he asked for something entirely different, 2 pieces of bread, so that I won't die on an empty stomach. If he had asked me, maybe I could have saved him. I gave him the bread, and he went to the gas chamber. He knew where he was going. What happened after people undressed? They were led down a corridor to the gas chamber. As one chamber filled up, they were taken to the second, and then to the third. That's how it worked. What did the men of the Sonderkommando do after people were taken to the gas chamber? We collected the clothes and belongings that people left behind after undressing. We had 30 to 45 minutes before the trucks arrived to take everything to the Canada camp. We used that time to find something for ourselves among the items. The SS turned a blind eye when we searched through the clothes. However, they warned us not to take valuables and kept an eye on us to ensure we didn't. Once, while I was sorting and arranging clothes, I picked up a package and an SS man noticed. He grabbed me and shouted, "What are you doing?" I replied, "Look, I picked up the package, but there's nothing here for you. But if you want, I have something for you." He asked what it was, and I answered, "In one of the packages I found some coffee beans." Of course, I was willing to give him the box. He said, "Very well," and left. Then I went back to my bed, where I had placed the package with the coffee, picked it up, and gave it to him. In fact, we had plenty of time to search thoroughly and find things. That's because we were alone in the changing room, except for a few SS men. The truck drivers who took the items to the Canada camp were not allowed to enter the crematorium. The prisoners of the Sonderkommando personally loaded the belongings onto the trucks, which took them directly to the property depot. Meanwhile, what was happening inside the gas chambers? After people were suffocated by inhaling the gas, the doors were opened for ventilation, and then the bodies were removed and brought back to the changing room. Who removed the bodies from the gas chambers? We removed 1 or 2 bodies by hand. Sometimes we used a long pole. We grabbed the body by the neck and pulled it out. It was better to use the pole than our hands, because many of the victims soiled themselves while they were dying. So, we avoided touching the bodies with our hands. We preferred to remove them with the pole. After the bodies were handled in the changing room, they were taken to the furnaces. All the prisoners of the Sonderkommando participated in removing the bodies from the gas chambers. even those who usually worked elsewhere, like the one who tended the garden in the crematorium yard, or the one responsible for carrying coal to the furnaces. That was the most complicated and unpleasant work. Gradowski was killed during the revolt at crematorium, 4 on October 7, 1944, or in retaliation for it. Leuenthal, Langfuss, and Hermann are believed to have been killed in November 1944. Gradowski wrote the following note, found buried in one of the crematoria of Auschwitz. "Dear finder of these notes, I have a request to make of you, which is in fact the practical purpose of my writing. That my days of hell, that my hopeless tomorrow may find purpose in the future. I am conveying only a part of what happened in the hell of Birkenau Auschwitz. You will understand what the reality was. From all this, you will have an image of how our people perished." Help us keep this project alive here on YouTube by subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, God bless you all, and see you soon.